I have been watching people make money decisions for 84 years, not from a distance, from inside markets, through annual letters, through conversations at shareholder meetings, through the newspaper every morning at 5 when the house is quiet. And across all of that time, I have watched the same financial failure repeat itself with remarkable precision. Not similar failures, not loosely related patterns. The exact same failure, wearing a different costume depending on which decade you are standing in. I have watched it claim boomers, Gen X, millennials, and I am watching it claim Gen Z right now, with the added cruelty that Gen Z knows more about personal finance than any generation before them, and it is still happening. Meet Thomas. He is 49 years old. He manages operations for a logistics company in Phoenix, Arizona. He has worked hard for 24 years, earns $115,000 in 2026, has a house with equity, 2 cars, a retirement account that looks reasonable on paper, and a persistent low-grade anxiety about whether any of it adds up to what he actually needs. Thomas has never made a dramatic financial mistake. He did at each stage of his life exactly what his generation told him doing well was supposed to look like. That is precisely the problem. If this is a conversation worth finishing before your next financial decision, subscribe and turn on the bell. What I'm going to show you plays out across the full arc of 4 generations. And it is still playing out right now. The generation that came of age after World War II was handed one unquestioned piece of wisdom: own a home. Their parents had rented. Renters were vulnerable. Owners were stable. The house was the American dream, and it was not wrong. Property appreciated, communities were built, families were stabilized. But somewhere in the execution, the house became the entire plan. Not the foundation, the plan. Retirement would come from the house. Security would come from the house. The measure of success was the house. Men and women who made their mortgage payments faithfully for 30 years, maintained their properties with genuine care, arrived at 65 with an asset they were proud of, and discovered that most of their net worth was locked inside walls they lived in. The pension they counted on had been restructured. The liquid savings needed to fund 25 years of retirement were far smaller than the house's appraised value implied. The home was not the trap. The belief that the home was sufficient, that performing the arrival of wealth was the same as building the foundation of it, that was the trap. Thomas's father is 81, living in Scottsdale with a house worth approximately $700,000 and savings of approximately $90,000. He is not in crisis, but the number on the house is not the number that determines whether he can comfortably pay for the next decade of his life. The generation that followed watched this and chose differently. They would earn more, diversify more, live better, and they did earn more. Gen X produced some of the highest earning professionals in American history. But here is what happened. Every time income rose, lifestyle rose with it. A promotion brought a car upgrade. 6 figures brought a larger house. The overseas holiday became annual. Each individual decision was reasonable. The gap between what came in and what went out stayed nearly identical year after year, just denominated in larger numbers. At 52, she has equity and assets and a life that looks like success. She also has 10 years until retirement with savings tighter than they should be for someone who has been earning well for 2 decades. Every raise became a new floor for spending rather than an expansion of the margin between income and need. Thomas lived this precisely. His income grew from $68,000 in 2001 to $115,000 today. His lifestyle expanded at almost exactly the same rate. He cannot identify a single irresponsible decision across 24 years. He simply allowed the definition of normal to rise with his income, and the distance between what he earns and what he needs to earn never widened into wealth. Now, the generation that watched the 2008 financial crisis erased the early careers of an entire cohort at precisely the moment they were supposed to be building their foundation. That damage was real and not their fault. What followed, however, is the most culturally sophisticated version of the same mistake I have ever observed. When traditional signals of arrival became genuinely inaccessible, an entire culture arose to say they had been thinking about wealth wrong. Experiences are the real wealth. Memories last longer than possessions. You cannot take money to the grave. The full passport, the restaurant table, the concert ticket, these became the legitimate alternative to the assets that were out of reach. What actually happened? Spending on experiences replaced saving and investing during the decade in which compounding would have had the most time to work. A 30-year-old who invests consistently from 30 to 60 has 30 years of compounding. One who begins at 40 has 20. The difference in terminal wealth at the same contribution rate is not 30%. It is more than double. The decades spent performing the alternative kind of wealth was the most valuable compounding decade of an entire financial life. The cultural endorsement was nearly universal. The financial cost was enormous and invisible. And now the generation that grew up with all of this information, they know what an index fund is at 19. They open brokerage accounts before their first full-time job. By every measure of financial literacy, they have surpassed every generation before them. And many are making the same mistake, because knowledge about money is not the same as building wealth. The version of the trap awaiting the most financially literate generation in history is the most visually sophisticated one ever constructed. The arrival signal lives online. It is the aesthetic, the apartment that photographs well, the brands that communicate taste and discernment, the technology setup that signals a certain level of arrival to an audience measurable in real time. She has a brokerage account and puts $50 a month in and posts about it. She also spends $250 a month on things whose primary function is how they appear on a screen. The investing is real, the numbers stay small, the performance of wealth moves faster than the accumulation of it. Here is what every version of this failure has in common. In every generation, the world around a person defines what doing well is supposed to look like. A certain kind of home, lifestyle, experience, or aesthetic. And when that person can finally afford to signal that definition, they do. It feels like progress. It feels like arrival. It feels from the inside exactly like the responsible next step. What it actually is. The prioritization of the signal of wealth over the substance of wealth. The costume over the foundation. The investors I have watched escape this across every generation in every decade all did the same thing. They separated the signal from the substance. They consciously chose to look less wealthy than they were so that their actual wealth could grow faster. They drove the older car while colleagues upgraded, stayed in the smaller house while the neighborhood moved up, skipped the trip, resisted the aesthetic upgrade, declined the lifestyle expansion, and put the difference somewhere that compounded without interruption. Let me give Thomas the framework. First, define the lifestyle ceiling before income reaches it, not after. What does a comfortable, meaningful life actually require annually, not aspirationally, actually? The gap between that number and his current income is not lifestyle room. It is compounding fuel. Every dollar of that gap directed into a maxed Roth IRA, a 401k at the employer match threshold, and a broad index fund is a dollar working for Thomas rather than performing for an audience. Second, let income growth compound rather than lifestyle expand. Thomas's income grew by $47,000 over 24 years. If the next raise goes 50% to investment and 50% to lifestyle, his retirement position changes meaningfully. If it goes entirely to investment until a defined target is reached, the timeline to genuine financial independence compresses by years. Third, measure wealth by optionality, not appearance. The wealthiest people I have known across 84 years are not the ones with the most visible assets. They are the ones with the most options, the ability to leave a job that is wrong for them, the ability to absorb an emergency without disruption, the ability to retire before they are forced to. These options are only available to people who built the margin between income and expenses wide enough to accumulate genuine capital, not to people who spent that margin signaling arrival. Let me come back to Thomas one final time. In the first version of his future, Thomas continues doing what his generation told him doing well looks like. His savings grow at the rate they always have. He arrives at 65 with a house, some savings, and a social security check. The same position his father arrived at, one generation later, with one generation more of income and opportunity behind him. In the second version, Thomas names what he has been doing. He defines a lifestyle ceiling and holds it. He maxes his Roth IRA, $7,000 in 2026, and directs future raises to his index fund contributions rather than to lifestyle expansion. He measures his progress not by what his life looks like from the outside, but by what it can afford from the inside. At 65, Thomas has options, not a number on a statement, not a house with a market value. Options, the freedom to work because he wants to, rather than because his lifestyle requires it. The security that every generation before him thought the signal of wealth would provide, and which only the substance of wealth actually delivers. The failure that has repeated for decades is not about income, intelligence, or discipline. It is about confusing the costume for the foundation. Boomers wore it as a house. Gen X wore it as a lifestyle. Millennials wore it as an experience. Gen Z wears it as an aesthetic. The costume changes. The mistake has not changed once in 84 years of my watching it. Subscribe to this channel and ring the bell. The next video goes into the specific mechanics, how to calculate your actual compounding fuel and build the structure that runs automatically. Subscribe so you do not miss it. You are wearing some version of this right now. The question is whether you are willing to see it clearly enough to take it off before it costs you the decade that would have made all the difference. This content is produced with the assistance of artificial intelligence for educational purposes only. Nothing here constitutes personalized financial advice. Consult a qualified financial professional before making any investment decisions.